Well, you've heard a ton of names floated for Secretary of State in the Trump administration. One of the finalists on the very short list is the former ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Question is, what have Ambassador Bolton and Mr. Trump talked about recently, and do their policies square with one another? We're going to ask the ambassador because he's sitting about 2 feet away. Ambassador, it's great to see you.
Glad to be here.
So let me just ask you the obligatory question, which you will not answer. What did Mr. Trump say to you?
Well, we had a very good meeting, and beyond that, I think, really, it's not, I am old school enough not to comment, but I was glad to have the opportunity. It was a very serious conversation, and we'll see what happens next.
So I knew you were going in there because it was reported last night as I was watching
There are a few reporters outside.
Including our own Peter Doocy. You can't get anything by him. But I was thinking about you as I watched Trump's speech last night, and this is one of the lines that came out of his mouth, and I'm quoting. "We will pursue a new foreign policy that finally learns from the mistakes of the past. We will stop looking to topple regimes and overthrow governments." Now, that's a direct kick in the knees to the neocons, and not just the neocons, but to all supporters of the war in Iraq, and that would be you, too.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a neocon, but look, I think the question of how you handle a rogue regime depends on the circumstances. And the argument about whether regime change, are you for regime change or against regime change, is not the same as having a policy discussion. The regime change argument, so-called interventionism, is part of the toolkit. It's not at the policy level. It's like asking somebody, do you favor a knife or a spoon? Well, for what? Do you eat soup with your knife? Do you cut meat with your spoon? So I think in those circumstances, almost all foreign policy has to be derived from the facts that confront us and what American national interests are at stake. And that, I think, is at the core of Trump's message. He said it repeatedly during the campaign, that foreign policy should be governed by protecting American national interests.
And virtually every time I heard him bring up foreign policy, he brought up the Iraq War, which seems to me to form the framework of his view of the rest of the world. And he keeps saying, and he said it last night, I think he said we spent $6 trillion. We could have rebuilt America twice for that. We didn't learn anything from it. And that does seem, and again, it's not a criticism of you. I'm just trying to square your beliefs, which seem at odds with one another. That seems different from your view, very different.
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, no president ever finds top advisors whose views are 100% in confluence with his.
Right.
If he could find such a person, he'd certainly be entitled to appoint them to be a senior advisor. You'd have to ask whether or not that's actually the best thing. You know, you think back to Eisenhower, for example, having structured debates about what American nuclear policy ought to be vis-a-vis the Soviet Union before he decided what to do. But I think more importantly...
But this is a pretty basic thing, though. I mean, he's saying the whole basis of the way I see the rest of the world is the series of wars that didn't go well, and you're saying I would take Saddam out again if I could.
Well, but he has also said, and I think this is important, confronted with the circumstances that we faced in Iraq in 2011, it was a mistake for Obama to pull the troops out, because that then led to the mess we have now. So what I see is the criticism that many people make about the Iraq war is that the whole thing is a block of granite from the time of the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein until today. It's just that we made one decision and everything happened inextricably bound to that first decision, and that's not the case. And so I think he has demonstrated the sophistication to see that it's a series of decisions. He will come into office on the 20th of January having done nothing to be responsible for the environment that he inherits, and he will then have the task of trying to make sense out of it. And it is a mess that we face around the world, a very grave threat.
That's a really interesting point.
So there's a lot to be done.
John Bolton, former ambassador to the United Nations, thanks a lot for joining us.
Glad to be here.